Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Pond, awards editor of TheWrap, and we're happy to have you here for our 2021 award screening series and today's Oscar nominees showcase of the 5 films nominated in the Best Documentary Short Film category. We're going to start by showing some clips from the films, and then we'll go right into a conversation with the filmmakers of all 5 nominated films. So for the audience, please participate in the live chat. You can do that during the conversation by sharing your thoughts about the films. Let us know where you're watching from. I know these 5 shorts were filmed all around the world, so I imagine we have a global audience for them too. Before I introduce our guests, here's a brief look at the 5 nominated films.
People don't know who she was as an individual. They don't know. They just know that she was just a young Black girl who was worth $1.79. They don't know.
LATASHA would always talk about when we got older, we could own businesses. Because every time we go into a store, they either following us, giving us dirty looks, disrespecting us. Don't you want to have something on your own?
She wanted to be a lawyer, so that's what she was aiming for, to get good grades. She had all A's. She just tried a little bit harder. She just didn't want to end up a statistic.
Sometimes I think, how did I get this far and she not here? I know she'd be married by now. She loved the fellas. She probably would have 3 kids by now. She'd be an awesome mother.
She was a loving person. I still appreciate her for being who she was back then.
J'ai vu des photos dans les camps. C'est tellement ignoble et abject qu'on ne peut pas le répéter.
Ça va nous permettre de transmettre son histoire, de ne pas oublier le passé.
J'ai mis tant de temps à oublier.
In Yemen, a civil war there has created a humanitarian disaster.
For every child killed by bombs and bullets, dozens are starving to death.
This could be the world's worst famine in 100 years.
Half of the country's health facilities are shut.
Patients and staff are often unable to reach clinics because of the heavy fighting and the airstrikes.
الحمد لله القرآن الكريم أعطانا ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا.
يفكر على إنه ربما إن إذا استمرت الحرب نفقد كل الأطفال.
Only democracy can save us from this disaster of the colonial government of China. People can get fired for their political stance. People can get politically censored. So just imagine what will happen if we fail.
We often have the feeling that if we are losing the fight and we could no longer safeguard the future of the city, it is meaningless for us to think about our own future.
real pleasure to welcome Kris Bowers, our composer.
I'm very aware of the fact that I'm a Black composer. I've been wondering whether or not I'm supposed to have gotten to the point that I've gotten to.
Well, never think that you're not supposed to be there, because you wouldn't be there if you wasn't supposed to be there. Goes back to slavery.
The reason why I love this film so much, it feels like I'm watching my own family, and I was blown away by it.
Growing up in the South, I knew when I got of age I was going to leave there. Los Angeles, California. That's where I want to go.
There's an intimacy to this exchange within the sphere of Black masculinity that is so rare to see. I think it's a balm for these times.
People are constantly throwing up things to stop you in life. But you've got to know you cannot stop me.
And the winner is Kris Bowers.
Green Book.
Can you tell me just what is concerto? You did it.
He surprised you a little bit.
Welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce director Sophia Nahli Allison from A Love Song for LATASHA, producer Alice Doyard from COLETTE, director Skye Fitzgerald from Hunger Ward, director Anders Hammer from Do Not Split, and director Kris Bowers from A Concerto is a Conversation. Thank you all for being part of this. And Sophia and Skye, welcome back. I know, Sophia, we had you on a panel a month ago, and Skye, we saw you back when you were nominated for Lifeboat, and we were doing these in person. So
that's right, exactly.
Nice to see you again.
Yes. So, and the rest of you, welcome. Thanks for joining us. You know, this is always one of my favorite panels and always one of my favorite categories. And these are 5 really powerful films. So congratulations on those. I want to start by just going around and asking you, tell us a little bit, for people who haven't seen your film, tell us a little bit about your film and what led you to make it. Sophia, let's start with you. What led you to A Love Song for LATASHA?
A Love Song for LATASHA is a short documentary that reimagines the life of LaTasha Harlins. For those that don't know, LaTasha was a 15-year-old Black girl in South Central who was killed at a convenience store, liquor store, accused of stealing $1.79 bottle of orange juice. But she was not stealing, and her murder was one of the catalysts for the 1992 LA riots. And I wanted to tell this story because I am a South Central native, born and raised in Los Angeles. I was a young girl during the riots, and it was really important for me to excavate this story, to remember LaTasha beyond the context of her trauma, and to build a spiritual archive of healing for those that knew her. And the film really takes us through this journey and these memories of her best friend and her cousin, who were both 14 and 15 years old at the time of her killing. But the film really focuses on her life and rebuilding this memory of who LaTasha is.
Mm-hmm. Alice, what led you to, well, first of all, tell us who Colette is and what led you to make a film about her?
So first, I want to say thank you, Steve, to host this event. And I feel immensely privileged to be with Sophia, Kris, Anders, and Skye, like in this community of great talents. And Colette, our film Colette, is called after Colette Marin-Catherine, one of the last survivors of the French Resistance. And she's 90-year-old, and she's revisits her past and the death of her brother, Jean-Pierre, with the help of a very young aspiring historian, Lucie. Lucie is 17 years old, and she's the age that Jean-Pierre was when he got arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 because he had laid some flowers on the grave of another resistant members killed by the Nazis. So it's Colette and Lucie, they travel to Germany, to Jora, to this forced labor camp where Jean-Pierre died. Voilà, we see two women separated by ages, but that find strength in each other's presence to have the courage to go back to where they to go for Colette and to discover for Lucy. And there's a tension that we were blown away by while making this film is between Colette, who had to forget to survive the war, and Lucy, who wants to remember to move forward. So this is the film about these two strong women, and we decided to do this with Anthony because Anthony's passion is to document history, and my passion is to give voice to people who have strong story to tell and to record their emotions. And we met Colette in Normandy when we were together with Anthony, and we were blown away by her personality.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Skye, how about you? I mean, this is part of a series of films you've made on various aspects of the refugee crisis. But what led you to Yemen, and tell us a little bit about the film.
Yeah, Hunger Ward is really the first film to come out of war-stricken Yemen in about 7 years. So what we do is we embedded in 2 TFCs, therapeutic feeding centers, where doctors and nurses are doing kind of this Sisyphean task of trying to just, execute the simplest of things, save the child, save the life of a starving child. So it's the capstone film in a trilogy about displacement in the Middle East that I've done. And it's sort of based on this principle that that I deeply believe that cinema can be a force for good in the world. It can be something that can intervene in a very particular way, because cinema is a confluence of arts, and engage people through the heart, in the hopes that they'll engage in the real world, in the physical world, to help change a geopolitical dynamic that's very real, that can be intervened on. So we've been using the film as sort of a vehicle for change with civil society groups, to pressure the Biden administration to change our own government's complicity in the conflict.
Mm-hmm. Right. Anders, what led you to Hong Kong?
So when the protests broke out in Hong Kong in June 2019, I was already traveling in the region. I'd been to South Korea, and then I had headed on to Taiwan. And I was really surprised to see how a group of very young people went out in the streets and tried to take on one of the most powerful nations in the world, China, which is known to not react quietly or softly when they face resistance. These protests started as a protest against actually an extradition bill. The people who went out in the streets were afraid that political opponents and opposition politicians would face the risk of being sent to mainland China to stand trial. In mainland China, they have a very different judicial system than in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is actually was handed over from Britain to China in 1997, and the city was supposed to have its own way of autonomy. It was supposed to have, it's called a one country, two systems principle. So the people in Hong Kong, they grew up with far more democratic rights than people in mainland China, like freedom of press, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. And very soon these protests turned and became much bigger because people were really afraid that they would lose all these basic human rights. So when I went there, I became totally fascinated by the intensity of the street. I felt it was one of the most important events in international politics, and I wanted to capture those protests as close as possible. And then they continued far much longer and became much more dramatic than I and everyone else expected.
Right. So, Kris, I mean, you didn't have to look very far afield to find your subjects, and since the movie's about yourself and your grandfather. But tell us what, you're a successful film composer. What led you to want to make a movie and to make this particular movie?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. It was a pretty fortuitous moment. So my co-director, Ben Proudfoot, and I have known each other for about 5 years, and I've always just been staying in touch and, trying to find a project to work on together. And so originally he reached out because he was commissioned by the LA Phil to write a piece that, or to film a piece that talked about the intersection of LA and music. And being that I'm from Los Angeles, and also I was writing this piece to be premiered at the Disney Concert Hall with American Youth Symphony, he felt like this violin concerto might be an interesting thing to cover or to follow me working on. And it just so happened that the day we met, I was coming from an event that was celebrating my grandfather, and it was like a Tuesday morning, and Ben was like, "Why are you so dressed up on a Tuesday morning? We're just meeting to talk about this thing." And I told him about my grandfather and this cleaners that he has in downtown LA on Central Avenue, and told him my grandfather's story, how he's from the Panhandle in Florida and was the eldest boy of 13 kids, and grew up on a farm and hitchhiked here in the 1940s by himself without any destination in mind. Ended up in LA, and then a couple of years later owned this cleaners and later the Block, and really kind of established this whole foundation and the groundwork for my family here. And Ben immediately was like, "That's a much more interesting story than this concerto. Can we figure out how to tie those things together?" And he asked if I would be willing to interview my grandfather and if my grandfather might be interested. And so, it was in that first conversation that we kind of talked about this idea of showing my family's history and looking at, not only my grandfather's story, but I feel like my family's really proud of the fact that we can go back to like the first slave that was bought in New Orleans. And so we talked about this idea of going from slavery to the Walt Disney Concert Hall, and how, talking to my grandfather about his journey and what he did for it to be possible, not only for me to be here, but for me to have the success and the platform that I have now. And so really from that point on, it just became this conversation between my grandfather and I. And for me, it felt like such a gift because, we made this film like really just the two of us. At that point, LA Phil was no longer involved, and it was just us kind of making this film because we thought it was something interesting to follow. And for me, it just became this special moment to be able to sit and talk to my grandfather for hours and ask him about his story and his life and his journey, and reflect on how, this incredible journey of his even made it possible for me to be here. So yeah, that's how I could be.
And his dry cleaning shop is still up and running, right?
Yeah, the dry cleaning shop it's called Bowers and Sons Cleaners. My aunt runs it now, and it's still going, and it's like a huge part of our family. Yeah. Right.
Well, I want to ask everybody, go around with one more question, which is basically, what were the particular challenges that were the toughest for you when you were making this movie? And it could be creative or financial or whatever. I mean, what were the biggest challenges, and how did you overcome them? So Sophia, let's go back to you.
I think the biggest challenge is it was really beautiful to have this challenge, but thinking about the idea, I really, within the film, wanted to interrogate, what does it mean to rebuild an archive? What does it mean to take oral history, take memories, and find and conjure these images that are in conversation with them? And so how do you tell a story when that tangible archive isn't there and it's a story of the past? So that was an exciting challenge of just, what does this blueprint look like for myself? Also funding, really wanting to be honest about, it's hard for stories about Black girls and about Black women to receive funding. A story that is 30 years old, but I'm just really grateful for the team I had. It was a very small team, and that was both intentional and also just what we were able to do at that time. I was the DP, director, editor, and producer. And then I had my creative producer, Janice Duncan, and my producer, Famu Dorji, and we were the main team for all of production. And so it took a long time because of that, because I needed it to be a very intentional and spiritual process. I needed to make sure that throughout it, we were decolonizing all of the facets of filmmaking from pre to post, and that we were intentional with our relationships with Ty and Shanice, making sure that healing was always a part of this. So the challenge was definitely funding and having a small team, but I can't see it happening any other way. It was supposed to be a small team so that it felt like this intimate family coming together to remember and rebuild and retell these memories and the stories. And so I think that's why for me it's so exciting to see LATASHA, the memory of LATASHA celebrated. Just when we think about historically how Black girls have been erased from the archive, how Black women are erased from the archive, what does it mean for someone like LATASHA Harlins from South Central to be celebrated, for her name to be known globally?
Yeah. I mean, one of the beautiful things about the film is it's about her, but it's not, and then she did this and then she did that. It's very lyrical in the way that it revisits her. I mean, I assume that was, that was something that was always important to you?
Yes, I always wanted this to feel like we were moving through this portal of memories, that we were invited into this sacred psychic space of these two Black women, these memories of them as young girls. So Shanice Harlins was 14 years old when LATASHA was killed, and Ty was 15 years old. And so I always wanted to recenter Black girlhood, reminding people that LATASHA was a child, she was a girl, but also celebrating the beauty, the nuances of Black girlhood. What does that sacred, intimate space look like? And always wanting it to feel like we're moving through these dreams. We're all excavating this archive and these memories together. And actually, Steve, I can say the hardest part when I think about it now was actually getting to the moment where we do have to discuss LATASHA's murder. From the beginning, always very intentional to not incorporate that footage, understanding the harm that footage created for the community, the harm of seeing death for Black people and not wanting to re-trigger that. So really grateful for the conversation that I had with my animator, Buki Badunrin, about ways that we can explore other tactics to help retell this story that would complement Ty's voice, but would never offer any images that could re-trigger or be harmful for the community and for Ty and Shanice.
Right. Yeah. Alice, what were the particular challenges for you guys on your film?
Yeah, I would say there was, but there's many challenges when you make a film. But I would take two of them if I can. So the first one is that it was that Colette did not want to come at the first place. I mean, she had always wanted to stay away from Germany. So why would she go on this pilgrimage with us? So this was at the beginning of before we even brought the camera. There was this necessary discussion with Colette, and we spent 6 months discussing what it would mean for her in her life. She was 90, so what would mean for her to go back or to go to the camp to see where her brother died. And so to do this, we had to build this bond of trust and to organize a secure environment for Colette. This was done thanks to, of course, Anthony, but also to all the people, and I think of the other producer, Annie Small, who really carried. We made a nest for Colette, and I think this is particularly important because this allowed us afterwards to be very close to her emotion, and to arrive with the camera very close to her. She knew that if she wanted to say stop, like she does in the scene with the mayor, we do stop the camera. So she was feeling in a secure environment. As well as Lucy. Lucy was 17. It's very young. So I had myself daughters of this age. So I knew how to handle someone of this age, but it was very delicate because you have to protect someone who's so young on such an emotional journey. And so this was the first challenge. And the second challenge, I would say, was that we were in an international team. They were French, as you can hear. There was American, of course, Anthony. There was there were German people members. There were Dutch, Italian. So we were very from all over the world. So it's not bad to talk about World War II and this alliance of people trying to do good together and eradicate fascism. But it was also a challenge on the filming. And we had, for example, Steve, simultaneous translation, so that Rose, our DP, could know what was said, so that she would go close or a bit further away, even though she was because she could understand what was going on the set. Thanks to all this, so this was the second challenge. But I mean, this was really, you know how we say that you do a film. I mean, the film is great if the challenge are overcome, and maybe the greater the challenge are, maybe the best.
Right. Yeah,
we can try to be.
Right. I mean, I think one of the lovely things is Colette is such a, she presents herself as such a strong woman, and so I don't cry, and then she ends up crying and it being very affected. Was she comfortable with that being on screen?
Yes, Steve, because we had discussed this before. So she was, and when she was not comfortable, she said, "This, please, we don't go." So she was very comfortable, although I would say that she was surprised herself, I think, and so was Lucy. They were surprised by the maybe they did not expect this amount of emotion. When we arrived in the camp, before it was very lovely, very animated, it was fun. And the hour, the time when we arrived in the camp, they were in a car, and Colette was talking to Lucy, and there was a silence in the car, and Colette said, "Look at the trees. They might remember the people who died there. Some of them are more than 100 years old, and they might remember." And Steve, we were in the car. We silence, and then we started to cry. And we knew on that moment that the 2 days filming in the camp would be extremely emotional.
Right. Yeah. Skye, how about you? I mean, Hunger Ward could not have been an easy film to make.
Yeah, there were some obvious sort of practical considerations to making the film, Steve. First off, Yemen is a conflict zone, so there was the constant threat of just small arms fire, in particular in the south, and then missile strikes in the north. So we had to mitigate those risks as much as we could. And then there were just like simple practical things as a filmmaker. How do you transfer your footage and clone your footage when there's no electricity, right? And so we were on a constant hunt for the right generator and diesel just to run our laptops and to get all the footage safely cloned each night. And that was sort of an ongoing task that just needed to be done. So that was sort of this extra piece that we were always working with. But more importantly, probably the biggest challenge of the entire project, frankly, was just the daily grief of seeing children struggle to survive. Just to take a breath because of what the war has wrought in the country in terms of access to the simplest thing, food, and that that shared grief that we experienced with the families and with the healthcare workers was challenging and ongoing and dynamic, and it was shared. It was a shared experience, and you know, I don't know if you know this, but I actually come from a theater background, so I have a graduate degree in directing for the stage, and then somehow along the way I migrated into film. And one of the projects that I did as a director in grad school was Shadowlands by C.S. Lewis. And there's a quote I took from that film when I filmed, that stage play, when I filmed Hunger Ward, because I thought it spoke to what I might discover in the film. And he says in the play, we are like blocks of stone out of which the sculptor carves the forms of men. The blows of his chisel, which hurt us so much, are what make us perfect. And that quote I've carried with me for years, but I actually brought it to Yemen with me to share with the doctors based on this long dialogue I had with them beforehand, because they, at least one of them, Dr. Al-Sadiq, had experienced how grief that she experienced as a caretaker was something that shaped her work on a daily basis and actually motivated her to continue the work despite all the challenges that were facing her. So that was something that I anticipated would be hard on the project, and that turned out to be true. But it was also a motivator. So it was something that motivated those we collaborated with, and certainly our own work while we were in the country.
Yeah. I mean, the film is extraordinarily powerful, and it also at times it's definitely hard to watch. I mean, how do you determine how much you can show, you know, when it's children who are basically starving to death, how much of that you can put on screen? Is that a tricky thing to figure out?
Yeah, of course. It's a constant tension, right? Especially in a film like this where, you know, we filmed a lot of very graphic material, a lot of it that we didn't include. But, you know, my philosophy on that whole tension, which has existed in the nonfiction world for generations, is that, you know, I think if we in the doc community hewed to this idea that if something's hard to look at, then we turn away, that we don't look at it, that we flinch, you know, I think that's a really dangerous idea. And I'm not saying that we should include anything gratuitous, right? But if it's there for intent and for purpose, I think we ought to include it and make sure an audience can engage with it. Because, you know, if we start to turn away from the hard things, right, then they don't have the opportunity to reshape public dialogue. And in this particular case, to sort of reshape, you know, important dialogue about how civilians are suffering because of our government's own complicity in this conflict. So I'm a big believer that just because something's hard to look at doesn't mean we shouldn't include it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Anders, what were the big challenges for you making Do Not Split?
So in this documentary, we are following the protests, which started in the summer 2019 and then continued for about 7 months. So it was a much longer period than expected, and it became much more dramatic on every level, I would say, because it was a lot of violence. So we had the challenge of filming that, and which has several challenges, of course. I was normally following one protester by the day, and I didn't want to be in their way or make any kinds of problems for them. At the same time, I was very close to their trauma, like their biggest trauma so far in life. They felt that they were fighting for their future. They felt that they were losing their basic democratic rights in the city they grew up. And they wanted to try to defend those human rights. It was parts of the period were like this great solidaric feeling, but it became more and more desperate. People were starting to lose hope, and the protesters also became very afraid of the police, because a lot of the protesters were quite brutally handled by the police, which you can also see in the movie. And then they were facing these potential long prison sentences. So I was following protesters who were constantly afraid of their future, really felt they had to fight for their cause. At the same time, they were running and hiding in the streets of Hong Kong. And I was filming all the time, trying to keep the camera stable in a very unpredictable situation. So I think that it was both on a physical and on a personal level. There were all these constant challenges and this incredible intensity, and I could feel it. I was no way taking any of the same risks as the protesters around me, because they were facing these both beatings by the police and potential long prison sentences. I could be hit by random tear gas canisters or rubber bullets or something like that, but it was not. I was the one taking the smallest risk, I would say. But I had to capture that intensity and make it feel as real as possible for the viewers, which is a challenge, because I've been in other challenge situations before, and it's not always possible to mirror that directly. And that's what I really want to do in this movie, to go as close as possible and just capture the atmosphere of the protests in the streets.
Yeah, I mean, the film really does sort of plunge us into the middle of that chaos, it feels like. Was that all your footage? Did you use crowdsourced footage of people?
No, I made it a point to go into the sequences that I filmed myself, because that I felt that was the right way to tell a very chaotic story. But then we had a change with the pandemic, where you had when the corona pandemic broke out, it basically stopped the protests, because the protesters themselves were afraid of the virus. At the same time, you had all these new restrictions in Hong Kong, like in the rest of the world. And in that period, some of the activists I have followed started filming themselves. So we have a shift in the movie where they are filming themselves with their mobile phones and then telling that part of the story. And then we had another very dramatic change where this new national security law is implemented, obviously by pressure from the political leadership in China, in Beijing. And that made the whole legal situation totally change in Hong Kong. A lot of basic democratic rights that the people in Hong Kong have had before suddenly disappeared. And then the protesters faced really long time in prison. Like 2 of the politicians we have in the documentary are in prison right now, and they are facing potential life in prison because of this new law. And what they actually did was just to try to gather last summer in July and organize a primary election, which is a basic democratic process in any other democracy. But through this year that we capture in the movie, Hong Kong went through this really big change. Unfortunately, a very negative change in the sense that democracy is disappearing.
Yeah. So, Kris, I mean, for you, what were the biggest challenges? Obviously, this isn't something that you had done before, directing or co-directing a movie.
Yeah, I think that was a pretty big challenge, and just trying to find the story and find a way to, create a parallel between my grandfather's story and this journey with my violin concerto, and finding a way to compact all of that into, into being 13 minutes, I feel like was our biggest challenge, but something that like our editor, Lucas Dong, and the New York Times were incredibly helpful with in trying to find a way to fit all of this information and all of this emotion, I think, into a short amount of time, but also really just using my grandfather and his story as the North Star, I feel like was so helpful, just because that conversation, I think another challenge for me personally afterwards is just that conversation happened so naturally, just because I grew up with my grandparents. I saw them almost every day growing up, and they were always a pretty safe place for me to express myself in vulnerable moments. And it wasn't until after we shot it that I reflected on, some of the questions I was asking or some of the things I was trying to explore myself. But in that moment, it was really just me asking my grandfather for his advice and talking to him. And so for me, it was a little bit difficult to let go of how my family was being, presented, or how I'm being presented, or any of those kinds of things. And I think outside of that, maybe the other challenge is just that we finished filming right before the pandemic. The Concerto premiered in February of 2020, and so then we had to kind of shut everything down and figure out where to go from there. And Ben, my co-director, ended up losing his father shortly after that. And I think just a lot of the other difficulties that we all faced during that time kind of made it difficult to figure out how to finish the film and how to keep going. But I think it was really something that was helpful for us. I know that for me personally, and I talk to Ben about this often, just how much my grandfather's story started to become a beacon for all of us, to feel a sense of hope, or to feel like we could make it through the difficulties that we were feeling, or the difficult moments we were feeling in our own personal lives. But yeah, I think just finishing it during the pandemic, and even some of the technical aspects like scoring remotely, or, being able to edit and mix remotely and all of that. But yeah, I feel like those are probably the two challenges for us.
Right. I mean, the film uses a fascinating technique, and that felt like I hadn't seen it before, where you and your grandfather are having a conversation, but you're having a conversation looking into the camera, which is a different dynamic than we're used to. How did you come up with that?
Yeah, that was another thing that happened in that first meeting Ben and I had, where his company Breakwater, they've really done a lot to. I think he prides himself on how much that company loves the short form, and one of the things that they started to do is use the Interrotron for most of their interviews to really get this close, intimate, tight framed presentation of this person. And for Ben, he feels like when we're seeing somebody express themselves and talk, and often, especially in the short form, we're seeing a lot of these things on a tiny device. It's really helpful to be able to see their whole face fill up that tiny device, and really be able to see how every aspect of their face and facial expressions are reacting or moving whenever they're telling these really difficult stories and or emotional stories. And so he always had this idea of having two Interrotrons facing each other, or having it so that we could be having a conversation with one another. And so he asked if we'd be into that, and for me, I was just open, and so that's how we did it. We had two Interrotrons where I was looking into one, and my grandfather looking into the other, and it really became pretty seamless. Like a couple of minutes in, it's something that I thought, especially for my grandfather, I was like hyper aware of how he was feeling, and being able to sit for that long. And I mean, he's 92 now, and he was 91 at the time, and it really started to feel very comfortable and very normal pretty quickly. And yeah, that's kind of how we did that.
Yeah. Well, I'll open this up to all of you. I mean, obviously the issues that you're dealing with in these films are ones that are very current, very much part of the current conversation. I'm wondering, Skye, you mentioned that it was important for you that you're trying to influence policy and get the Biden administration to address what the U.S. has done in Yemen. But I wonder, for all of you, is it important that these films become part of a larger conversation?
Yeah, I would say that's the main aim of making a documentary, to contribute to a bigger debate, and to put the spotlight on an issue that you feel is important. So that was definitely the case for our movie. The process we are focusing on in Do Not Split is unfortunately still ongoing, where you can see that democracy is disappearing by the day in Hong Kong. There have been so many dramatic events during the period we filmed, and then it just continued after. And we have also this strange situation with the documentary that Beijing went out against it, and have told its local media to censor the Oscars broadcast due to this movie, because they obviously don't feel that we really don't know. They haven't given this message directly to us. So, but according to media reports, this movie about the protest in Hong Kong and probably Nomadland as well, and due to former statements by the director, has led to this strange situation where Beijing is censoring the Oscar show, and the same then also happened in Hong Kong, where for the first time in 52 years, the Oscars will not be broadcasted live in the city, and no TV stations will show it. So in this way, the documentary has become a part of the story that we showed in the movie. And sort of Beijing is proving our point.
Steve, can I just jump in here? That reminds me, I'm once again revealing my theater background here, but Anders, what you just said reminds me of that old Bertolt Brecht saying that art should not hold up a mirror to reality, but it should be a hammer to shape it. And that's what I heard you just say. So it sounds like that's definitely your intent there. Steve, for us on our team, there's this researcher in Oregon named Paul Slovic who works for University of Oregon, and he coined this term called psychic numbing, which sort of refers to both compassion fatigue, but by how when numbers are so huge on something, we become numb to them. And I think that's something that film in particular, regardless of what the story is, can sort of pierce, right? I think the power of cinema, regardless whether it's your grandfather's story or the story of a young black girl who's been killed, or any of our stories here, it can pierce through that noise, right, in a really particular way. And there's a beauty to that I personally just really love. And that's why I think sort of the singular nature of our art form is so critical, right? That we use it, and we use this stage to really touch people in the heart, so that we can drive dialogue and drive engagement, regardless what the nature of that engagement is for each of your projects. So I concur with what you said, Anders, and I hope I share that with all of you in some form or fashion.
Mm-hmm. Right. Alice, I thought it was interesting because there's a story in the LA Times this morning talking about how little the younger generation knows and understands about World War II and about the Nazis and about the Holocaust. I mean, is it important to you to be keeping that kind of story alive?
Yes, Steve, this is true. It was our goal to address or to talk to a young audience. And so when we were happy to have Lucy on board, because she embodied this will to remember and to look at history without any political agenda, just to welcome the history and take care of the memory. So this was important. But Steve, I would like to answer the question you asked just previously. I know it's weird, but forgive me, because I realized that I did not answer when you said Colette happy with the film and with the emotion she showed. And yes, she's very happy and she's very proud of the film. And she showed it to, she's showing it to everybody around her. And like Kris' grandfather, she's now 93. And we made something of her life. Suddenly, she's with us. Like she will be with us, whatever happens on the 25th of April. And but I wanted to continue to your question. So you asked why to us it's important. So it's important to keep the memory of World War II. It's important also because it's a film about women, and there was Colette is a resistant, was a resistant during World War II, but she's also now a fighter. She's been a fighter all her life, and she's, you know, these strong women who are ready to give away their life to take care of others. To take care, so she took care of her mother, she took care of her father, she took care of the memory of her brother, and during the film she takes care of Lucy, and of the film today she takes care of the film because she wants to show it to the world. The first one happy about what's going on and the nomination, and so, and indeed it's a film that where the women had an important role in the production too. And in the photography, the director of photography, who's a woman too. So it's a film about women, and we think it's an important statement. And it's a film about a collective action. So I talked about the fact that we were from different countries. Colette decide to take part, to join the resistance, which is this collective alliance to fight fascism. And this is this resonates with the global issue we have to face, the global threat we have to face just now, and that we in the United Actions we can find a solution to preserve the common good, which has never been as important as today.
Right. Okay. Well, let me just conclude this with Sophia and Kris, because your films are both part of the conversation that, from the trial in Minneapolis to voting rights in Georgia, the conversation that your films are part of could not be more important than it is right now. So, how do you see your films, and what do you want them to do as part of that conversation?
I actually loved something Alice said. Alice, I don't mean to misquote you, but you said there wasn't a political agenda. This was about the memories. And that's what a love song for LATASHA was. So the film, I began working on a love song for LATASHA in 2017, which actually was the 25th year anniversary for the LA riots, the uprising, the 1992 uprisings. And I thought I was making a film for that moment. I thought I was making a film for us to have a larger understanding of who LATASHA was in context to Los Angeles history. And then I kept working on the film. It took 2 years to make, and I understood it was so much bigger than that moment. For me, it was always about engaging with an archive. It was always about disrupting and dismantling systemic oppression that has erased Black women archives, the archives of Black girls, and finally naming that we are the ones reclaiming this agency. We are the ones in charge of our narrative. But what's been really interesting to watch is just how this film transcends time and space. LATASHA's really had a mind of her own. And, the film premiered in 2019 on the festival circuit. And there were many moments where I thought the film kind of had a plateau, and it was really heartbreaking for me because there were times where I was terrified of my erasure in the process, of the film being erased within the process. But then when we were acquired by Netflix in 2020, what was really interesting is that was the year of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor that summer. And the week that A Love Song for LATASHA premiered, that the same week, that Wednesday, was when the Breonna Taylor verdict was announced. And now 2021, this makes the year of LATASHA's 45th birthday and the 30th for her killing. And it's been interesting because I think it speaks to how deeply ingrained anti-Blackness is within this society, that even when I am wanting to focus on memories or on art or experimentation or the archive, we can't remove the political no matter how much I want to at times, that was always a part of the story. And for me, I think it speaks to the larger issue of needing to address white supremacy within this country, needing to address the root of anti-Blackness within the US. And my ultimate goal for A Love Song for LATASHA is that when Black women and Black girls see it, they understand what healing could look like through film. They understand that film and documentary doesn't have to be extractive, and that they can reclaim their stories, they can build their archives, we can celebrate Black girlhood, something that has often not been celebrated. And I want to shout out movies that have inspired me within the celebration, thinking about Just Another Girl on the IRT or Eve's Bayou, you know, these films of the 90s that were so important for Black women and Black girls. And for me, this was always about how do you create a spiritual archive? How do you excavate these memories? How do you hold space for these memories? How do you heal throughout a process that has trauma attached to it, and wanting to create a blueprint that when we are exploring Black death, exploring this trauma, there's a way to do it that's caring. There's a way to do it that holds those that we are working with and does not re-trigger them or re-traumatize them. But it's obvious that we cannot remove the deeper root of the issue. I can't remove it from the story, no matter how much I wanted this film to be, this is for Black women, this is for Black girls, this is an archive, this is healing. We just see the cyclical pattern of anti-Blackness within the US. And there have been, throughout my process of working on this film and my research, there have been countless issues with seeing young Black girls adultified. You know, I really want to challenge the adultification bias of Black girls, which is something that happened to LATASHA and continues to happen. There were so many videos that we saw of young Black girls being tackled within their school by security guards, being tackled by police when they're at pool parties, there was a video that came out maybe in 2017 or 18 of a Black woman placed in a chokehold by a Korean store owner of a beauty supply store. So really wanting to make sure Black women are at the forefront of this conversation of Black liberation, as well as Black queer folks, Black trans folks, wanting to expand that Black liberation has to include all of us. It can't just include, one niche of Black identity.
Right. Okay. Kris, you want to take the final word on this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first, thank you, Sophia, for your film and your work. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Kris. My brother's a cellist, so I love the orchestra.
That's awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you all. Yeah, seriously. Similar to what Sophia said, I feel like for our film, it was impossible to separate that political from what we were trying to say with the film, just because really it was just me having this conversation with my grandfather and with his story, it's impossible to separate that when you are talking about a Black man traveling in the 1940s and also him trying to start a business in that time and all of that. And for myself, it's something that I didn't even really realize until in part having this conversation with my grandfather, in part even talking to my therapist or different things like that. But this imposter syndrome that I was feeling when I came to him, not really thinking about how much of that, comes from being just a Black man in this space and what that feels like. And so I feel like a lot of those things are things that just kind of continue to reveal themselves or make themselves feel incredibly important the more we dove into the story and the more we talked about it. And I also feel like my grandfather, he says something in the film that, and he said it often to me, that he actually preferred the racism in the South because at least they tell you. And he said in Los Angeles, they show you, in the South, they tell you. And I feel like that line for me sticks out not only in the film, but also thinking of my own experiences as a Black composer in this space and growing up in Los Angeles and seeing how racism can be very covert and malleable. And what does that look like to feel and see racism in spaces where society or those systems are trying to do whatever they can to mask it and to hide it and to make it feel as though it's not there. And so a lot of those things in the conversation, I feel like, are just natural aspects of who my grandfather is and what he preaches and some of the lessons he constantly wants to instill in me or in my family. And I think all that comes out in the film. And then outside of that, I think what our focus was, like one of the biggest compliments that we get with the film is whenever somebody calls and says that as soon as they finish the film, they immediately called their grandfather, their grandmother, their parent, and that connection to family, I feel like is the most important thing for me. Just thinking about these stories that my grandfather had that would have left this world with him had he not been able to share them and record them, and the importance of that, and how not only did this story serve as, again, a beacon for me or for any of us who touched the film and worked on it. I feel like from that point on, anytime we had any sort of difficulty or trying moment, especially in this last year, it was really helpful to think of my grandfather and how he was always solution minded, and how he acted in the face of a lot of the challenges that he had in that time. But yeah, again, most importantly, just looking at how he how being able to sit with him and capture these stories and record them feels like something I'll be able to have and cherish for the rest of my life, be able to pass on to my family, and how important it feels for us to do that, especially at a time where it's hard to connect with our elders and we're losing so many of them. It feels like this film, similar to Colette as well, just wanting to create a time capsule, or to capture that moment and capture these stories moving forward.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, obviously, these conversations we could keep having for a long time, and probably will. But for this, we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you all so much for being part of this. To the audience out there, thank you for joining us. You can be the first to know about upcoming screenings and events like this if you sign up for our free trial, TheWrap Pro, and you can also register for screenings or catch up on the ones you've missed by visiting TheWrap.com and clicking on the screenings tab. So. Thank you all. This was
thank you, everyone.
For really
beautiful
films and great conversation.
It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.